From the beginning of human history, man looks up at the sky, observes the stars, contemplates nature, and asks questions. Where did we come from? Why do we exist? How did it all begin? These questions cross generations and reveal something profound: the desire to understand life. Throughout the centuries, two paths have grown to try to answer these questions: faith and science. And often, these paths have been presented as if they were enemies, as if the light of science extinguished faith, or as if faith ignored the reality of the physical world. But does this rivalry truly exist? Do faith and science need to fight? Or can they both walk together, each revealing an aspect of the truth that God placed in the universe? The truth is that science is born from human curiosity, and that curiosity was planted by the Creator Himself. When we observe the world, we discover precise laws, perfect cycles, complex patterns. None of this is accidental. The book of Psalms, chapter 19, verse 1, declares, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth His handiwork." This means that the universe does not merely exist, it communicates. It reveals order, purpose, and wisdom. Science, by studying this order, is not moving away from God, but exploring the language by which God organizes creation. If we look at history, we realize that many of the great scientists were deeply religious. They believed that an ordered universe could only exist because an intelligent God created it. Isaac Newton, for example, studied the laws of motion and gravity, but also dedicated years to studying the scriptures. For Newton, understanding the universe was a path to understanding the mind of God. Johannes Kepler, who discovered the laws of planetary motion, once said that science was like thinking God's thoughts after him. These men did not see conflict between faith and science. They saw harmony. When we open the Bible, we realize that it never intended to be a scientific book. The Bible was not written to explain formulas, equations, or biological processes. It was written to reveal who God is and who we are in Him. The Bible contains spiritual and moral truths that science cannot measure. Science can explain how a child is born, but it is the Bible that teaches us that this life was dreamed of by God even before it existed. The book of Jeremiah, chapter 1, verse 5 affirms, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee." Science reveals the physical processes. Faith reveals the divine purpose. They are different dimensions that can walk together without nullifying each other. At the same time, it is important to understand that the Bible describes creation using the language of its time, with poetic figures and expressions that communicated profound truths in an accessible way. When the book of Genesis describes the creation of the world, the goal is not to present a scientific manual, but to affirm that everything that exists came from God, that He is the supreme creator, that the universe did not arise by chance, but from a perfect mind. What faith establishes is the why of creation. What science investigates is the how. And even in moments when science and faith seem to conflict, we need to remember that the problem is not in God or in creation, but in our interpretations. Science is always advancing, always learning, always correcting mistakes. Faith, in turn, is a relationship with God, which also deepens over time. When we understand this, we realize that tensions are natural, because we are limited beings trying to understand something immensely greater than us. Many people are afraid of science because they think it can destroy faith. But true faith does not fear questions, because truth withstands any investigation. And many people reject faith because they think it contradicts science, when in fact, faith speaks of a level that science does not reach. It speaks of meaning, of morals, of eternity, of salvation. Science investigates what is material. Faith reveals what is spiritual. And we, human beings, live in these two worlds simultaneously. When we observe the complexity of life, we realize that faith helps us see purpose in what science describes as a mechanism. Science can explain how DNA works, but it cannot explain why there is purpose in human life. Science can describe the formation of stars, but it does not answer why there is beauty in the universe. Science can measure brainwaves, but it does not explain why we feel love, hope, forgiveness, or faith. There is a dimension of life that can only be understood spiritually. The Apostle Paul expresses this profoundly in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 2, verse 14. But the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him, neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. Science helps us understand the physical world, but only the Spirit of God helps us understand the spiritual world. And, far from being enemies, these two forms of knowledge can coexist in an extraordinary way. When we look at creation with the eyes of faith and science together, the universe becomes even more impressive. The vastness of the cosmos, the precision of physical laws, the complexity of cells, the interdependence of life, everything points to a creator who not only made, but sustains all things. In the book of Colossians, chapter 1, verse 17, it is written, "And he is before all things, and by him all things consist." This means that the universe is not just God's work, it is continually sustained by him. Science describes the forces that hold the universe. Faith reveals who the source of those forces is. True wisdom is not in choosing between faith and science, but in recognizing that both can help us see different aspects of divine truth. When we look at the biblical trajectory, we realize that God never feared human knowledge. On the contrary, he encourages it. The book of Proverbs states that the wise heart seeks knowledge, and understanding is for those who desire to comprehend the truth. Faith is not an invitation to ignorance, but to the wisdom that is born from divine revelation. And this wisdom has always harmonized with the honest discovery of reality. When the psalmist declares that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork, he is not just speaking poetically, he is affirming that the very structure of the universe, in all its order and precision, reveals an intelligent, powerful, and intentional creator. Science, by exploring this universe, discovers aspects of this order and precision, and every discovery echoes what the Word already said many generations before. But despite this natural harmony between faith and science, many people see these two pillars as enemies. Part of this happens because, throughout history, there were moments when science was used to discredit faith, just as there were moments when religion tried to impede scientific progress. However, when we return to the gospel and the teachings of Jesus, we realize that the true conflict is not between faith and science, but between truth and pride. The faith that refuses to learn is not biblical faith, and the science that refuses to consider the possibility of God is not neutral science, but ideological science. When we observe Jesus' ministry, we realize that he never rejected human knowledge. On the contrary, he valued the observation of nature. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus uses scientific examples from daily life. He talks about the cycle of plants, about birds, about climatic phenomena, about natural processes. When he says to consider the lilies of the field or observe the birds, he is encouraging an investigative, sensitive, and open posture toward creation. Jesus never encouraged his disciples to reject what could be understood by reason. Instead, he taught them to interpret the world in the light of faith. Many Christian scholars, throughout the centuries, contributed directly to scientific advancement. This is no coincidence. They understood that studying creation was, in a way, studying the Creator's signature. Modern science was largely born from the Christian conviction that the universe is ordered and reliable because it proceeds from an ordered and reliable God. This view allowed mathematicians, physicists, and biologists to develop methods and theories based on the expectation that there is logic, patterns, and coherence in the cosmos. Faith, therefore, served as a foundation for the emergence of science, and not as its enemy. The Bible never attempted to answer questions that belong to the scientific field. It is not a physics treatise. It is not a biology manual. It is not a compendium of astronomy. The Bible is God's revelation about who he is, who we are, and what the purpose of existence is. It speaks of identity, redemption, morality, spirituality. Science, on the other hand, seeks to explain how the world works. When we try to transform the Bible into a science book, we end up distorting its purpose. And when science tries to answer questions of meaning, purpose, or morality, it goes beyond the limits of its competence. Therefore, faith and science do not nullify each other. They complement each other. Faith answers the why, science answers the how, and these two questions do not compete with each other. They dialogue. If we look, for example, at the text of Romans chapter 1, verse 20, we will see that the Bible affirms that God's invisible attributes, such as his power and his divine nature, can be understood through the things that are made. This means that creation itself, studied by science, is a testimony that points to the existence and character of the Creator. Scientific knowledge, in this sense, does not push someone away from God. On the contrary, when received with humility, it can bring them closer. At the same time, the Bible recognizes that there are limits to human knowledge. The book of Job, chapter 38, verse 4, when God asks Job where he was when the foundations of the earth were laid, reminds us that our understanding of reality is always partial. We can advance in technology, unravel mysteries of DNA, map distant galaxies, develop cures, and explain phenomena. But there will always be a frontier that escapes us. Faith helps us deal with these limits with serenity, without arrogance, and without despair. It teaches us that we do not need to understand everything to trust in the God who knows all things. In many modern discussions, especially on social networks, it seems that people feel the need to choose a side. Either you believe in God or you believe in science. Either you trust divine revelation or you trust empirical data. However, this duality is false. Jesus does not call us to live divided, but to live whole. We are spiritual beings, but we are also rational beings. We have faith, but we also think, analyze, investigate. To refuse the use of reason would be to deny a gift that God Himself gave us. But to refuse faith would be to cut the deepest bond with the meaning of life. When we look at biblical history, we see men and women who used both faith and reason. Joseph interpreted dreams, but also planned economically for the years of famine. Daniel received revelations, but also studied the laws and customs of Babylon. Moses received supernatural instructions, but also organized the people, mobilized strategies, and followed carefully ordered methods. Faith never nullified reason, it illuminated it. And if we analyze Jesus' teaching about truth, we realize how much He valued intellectual honesty. Jesus said that we would know the truth, and the truth would set us free. He does not invite anyone to flee from reality, but to face reality with courage. Science, when practiced with integrity, seeks exactly that, the truth. Faith, when lived with sincerity, also seeks the truth. Therefore, faith and science walk in the same direction when there is spiritual humility and academic honesty. The tension between faith and science generally arises when one tries to occupy the other's territory. Science cannot prove that God does not exist, just as the Bible does not intend to explain the chemical mechanisms of life. A telescope can show the beauty of the galaxy, but it cannot explain why the human heart yearns for meaning. Faith can say that God created the universe, but it does not need to explain the exact formula that governs the laws of thermodynamics. They are distinct but deeply compatible purposes. As we deepen this reflection, we realize that the true root of the opposition between faith and science is neither in the content of science nor in the message of faith, but in the human heart. Since the beginning, humanity struggles with pride, with the need to assert control, and with the constant attempt to define its own limits and its own truth. Science, when practiced with arrogance, tries to take the place of God, declaring that everything that exists can and should be explained only by matter, reducing life to chemical processes and removing any mystery or transcendence from it. On the other hand, a faith distorted by fear can close itself off to investigation, fear difficult questions, and reject discoveries that could broaden the understanding of creation. However, when faith is healthy and science is honest, both walk side by side as two windows that allow us to see the same reality from complementary perspectives. Jesus did not shy away from complex questions. On the contrary, he welcomed them. He dialogued with doctors of the law, answered the Pharisees, and invited his disciples to reflect. In Matthew chapter 22, verse 37, when Jesus says that we should love God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind, he makes it clear that faith is not an abandonment of reason, but an invitation to surrender it to God. Loving God with the mind means using the mind as an instrument of worship. This includes thinking, studying, researching, comparing, questioning, and seeking coherence. True faith does not fear science, because true science fundamentally confirms what God has already established. The Bible also reveals that God is a God of order. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33, it is written that God is not the author of confusion, but of peace. Science relies precisely on this order to function. If the universe were chaotic, unpredictable, and illogical, it would be impossible to develop physical laws, understand biological patterns, or create mathematical models. All of science exists because there is a foundation of order in the universe, and this order points directly to the character of God. The existence of constant and reliable natural laws is, for the Christian, a testimony that the Creator sustains all things by His word, as Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3 affirms. When we reflect on scientific advancement over the centuries, we realize that many of the great discoveries were made by people who had a deep faith in God. Newton saw his equations as ways to describe the language with which God governed the cosmos. Pasteur dedicated himself to science, motivated by the desire to alleviate human suffering, convinced that his work was an extension of divine compassion. Mendel studied genetics within a monastery, seeing his work as an investigation into how God structured life. These men did not experience a conflict between faith and science. They experienced a harmony that produced advancement, healing, and understanding. Faith illuminated their science, and science deepened their faith. One of the great challenges of the modern world is that by removing God from the equation, many try to attribute questions to science that it cannot answer. Science can explain how the heart beats, but it cannot explain why a person chooses to sacrifice their own life for someone they love. It can describe the neurological processes of sadness, but it cannot explain the meaning of pain. It can analyze human behavior, but it cannot define the moral value of a choice. That is why faith remains indispensable. Faith does not deny the facts of science, but contextualizes them within a greater purpose. At the same time, faith also needs to recognize and value the role of science in caring for creation. God called us to govern the earth, as stated in Genesis chapter 1 verse 28, and this includes developing technology, medicine, and knowledge to protect life. When we use vaccines, medical treatments, technological resources, and innovations to improve the world, we are, in a way, obeying God's mandate to care for creation. Mature faith does not reject science. It uses it to serve one's neighbor. However, it is important to remember that faith also warns us of the dangers of a dehumanized science. Science without values can create technologies that hurt, exploit, and destroy. Faith reminds us that every scientific discovery must be at the service of life, justice, and love. Science shows us what we can do, but faith reminds us what we should do. Without this balance, we run the risk of using knowledge to fuel selfish ambitions, manipulate people, or ignore human dignity. That is why we need both faith and science. One provides tools, the other provides direction. When we talk to people who reject faith in the name of science, we realize that often the problem is not science, but emotional wounds, disappointments with religious institutions, or distorted views of God. Similarly, when we encounter Christians who reject science, we often perceive fear, insecurity, or traumatic experiences of confrontation with ideas that seem to threaten their faith. The solution to these tensions is not to choose a side, but to allow the truth to heal, guide, and balance our view. The Word of God reminds us that true wisdom comes from Him. In James chapter 1 verse 5, it is written that if anyone lacks wisdom, they should ask God, who gives generously to all. This includes wisdom to interpret scientific data, wisdom to discern spiritual truths, wisdom to understand our limits, and wisdom to balance reason and faith. The Bible does not call us to reject knowledge, but to seek wisdom, and wisdom encompasses both faith and science. There is still another important point in this discussion: beauty. Science describes how things work, but it is faith that awakens admiration and enchantment before the functioning of the universe. When a scientist observes a cell dividing, he sees a biochemical process. When a Christian observes the same cell, he also sees the divine signature operating within life. Science reveals the structure, faith reveals the meaning. When we look at a starry night, we can describe it in astronomical terms, but also in poetic and spiritual terms. And both perspectives are true. Both are necessary. That is why the psalmist declares in Psalm chapter 19, verse 1, that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. He is not denying science. He is affirming that science, by revealing the complexity and grandeur of creation, echoes what the human heart has always known. There is a creator. Science observes the work. Faith recognizes the artist. Today, in an increasingly polarized world, the church needs to be a space where reason and spirituality walk together. We need to teach our children not to fear questions, to investigate, to research, to study, and at the same time, to nourish a heart sensitive to the voice of God. Faith should not be a refuge for those who have rejected critical thinking, but a force that enables the believer to see beyond what the eyes can see. And science, when practiced with humility, becomes a tool to expand our vision of the divine work. We have reached the end of another Bible Sayings for today. May the message inspire and strengthen your faith. We hope this portion of the Word has touched your heart. To continue receiving these daily moments of reflection, subscribe to the channel, leave your comment about what impacted you the most, and don't forget to share so more lives can be reached by the Word. We are counting on you. Thank you very much, and may God bless you.